All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. My name is Wenjie Zhao. I'm the board of director of TCFA, and I'm also a public relations officer of the organization. During the daytime, I'm a senior global economist at Credit Suisse. I'm very excited to introduce Professor Jason Furman to kick off today's program. Jason is the Aetna Professor of Practice of Economic Policy at Harvard University. Among numerous research and advisory roles he's held, he's best known for being the top policy advisor to President Obama. His current work is still hugely influential to the ongoing policy debate and decision-making process. Today, he will share his perspective on the US and Chinese economy and their economic policies. Few people can match Jason's ability to identify the most important part of a complex macroeconomic situation and break it down into digestible and nutritious pieces. So today, his talk is a real treat to us all. And so Professor Jason Furman, please give us some food for thoughts.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I thought I'd start by giving a little bit of context for the global economy, then talk about China. There's probably many people here that know more about China than I do, but I'll give you my perspective. And then spend most of my time, though, on the United States, which is what I wake up each and every morning thinking and worrying about. So this picture tells us, I think in a big picture, what we've seen over the last roughly year. If you look at the end of 2020, the blue bars, this is GDP relative to the pre-pandemic forecast. You saw China was actually above its pre-pandemic forecast. It had fully recovered and then some as of the end of 2020. And the United States was doing considerably better than most European countries, but it was still about 4% below where it should have been. By the third quarter of 2021, we have essentially convergence. Most of the major economies are around 2% below their pre-pandemic forecasts. China no longer looks quite as good as it did 3 quarters ago, and the Eurozone doesn't look nearly as bad. You have very similar positions relative to where you were prior to the pandemic. I want to start out by inquiring and interrogating why China has essentially, this is done slightly differently from what I just showed you. This is relative to the trend, not relative to the forecast. Why China had basically converged and then diverged a little bit from its trend line. Then talk about why the United States has gotten somewhat closer, but is stalling out. For China, the big thing that you see everywhere, you see in China, you see in Europe, you see in the United States, is services remain below trend. They continue to be constrained either by rules about COVID or by behavior in anticipation of COVID. China, of course, has much lower COVID than anywhere else, but it also is aspiring to even lower, to 0. And so it ends up with a decent amount of restrictions. For a while, you saw industry and construction actually above trend in China, making up for the weaknesses in the service sector, but you've seen that especially construction really grind to a halt in China and start to reverse, with Evergrande being the most dramatic, but not the only one. The backdrop for me in China is not just what's going on in the short run with COVID, with Evergrande and the like, electricity, but gross fixed capital formation has stopped at the increase in the past that it was on for a long time, but it's still been flat effectively at a very high level since around 2010. don't think any country in the world can effectively allocate that level of capital, and China is no exception. And with that gross fixed capital formation has come increasing debt. Kind of long talked about shifting not to higher growth, but smarter growth. And in some ways, I think that's what we're actually seeing now, as there's a reduction in construction and in terms of the policy environment in China, and we'll see the huge contrast to the United States. Fiscal stimulus is considerably smaller in China than it is in other advanced economies. It's even somewhat smaller than it is in other emerging market economies. China's also cut its rates much less than what we see in many other countries in the world. At the same time, overall financial conditions have tightened, as, for example, corporate junk bond yields have skyrocketed since the summer. So where does this leave us? I still think these are the bigger issues for China: the long-term structural challenges, the over-reliance on investment and debt, slowing productivity growth and a shift to state-owned enterprises. I think when you take those into account, you get an underlying potential growth rate over the next decade that's closer to a number like 5%, which is a perfectly respectable rate of growth for a country of China's income level, but nowhere near the miraculous level of growth it had gotten used to. And this is, of course, compounded by the recent challenges, the electricity crisis, real estate, and some of the issues associated with the Common Prosperity campaign. I don't have a forecast for China. Here are a set of forecasts for 2021. I would tend to take the under on most of these, expecting, based on what I've seen so far this year, growth more in the 7.5 to 8% range. And I would probably take the under next year, more like 5 to 5.5%. And most of that is less about short run issues around COVID, but around the current stance, especially of monetary policy and financial conditions, layered on top of the longstanding structural challenges. Let's now transition to the United States. In some ways, the United States is at the other extreme from China. COVID has wreaked a much more damaging toll in the United States. The United States is also the largest fiscal response of any country in the world. This compares it to the advanced economies, but most of the emerging and developing are smaller than all of these. Where has the US fiscal stimulus gone? In part, it's gone to where it was intended to go, which is higher output and employment. But it's also gone to increase imports and inventories, as domestic production wasn't sufficient to satisfy all of the demand, and it's gone to higher prices. So just to give you a sense of all of these, the first is output and employment. The United States has different ways of doing these trend numbers, which is why they don't line up exactly between my different figures. But the United States, as of Q3, was about 2.5% below its trend. And the important part here is you have this rapid recovery and then a slowing recovery thereafter. There's some temporary factors like Delta and the inability of supply chains to adjust that weighed on this. Think that we're going to see faster growth in the next quarter or two than we saw in the last quarter. Jobs are 6 million below what was projected. That is about 4% below. And the combination of those two, that output is less below projection than employment is, says productivity is up. I don't believe that what we've seen is a permanent upward shift in the level of technology in the economy. I don't think that's the case because you look, especially in Europe, you actually see productivity down. So what you're seeing is more taking the existing workers and working them harder than ever before, squeezing more things out of every part of the system because the labor shortages mean you can't attract the people that you want. I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think that's a permanent change. In fact, if anything, the pandemic may have lowered productivity because of the foregone investment over the course of the pandemic and some of the things you need to do to harden yourself and your company against the pandemic. As I said, job openings are just extraordinarily high at a level we've never, ever seen before. You see that across all of the advanced economies, but you see it about twice as much in the United States as you see it in Europe. So part of this is a reallocation due to the pandemic, but part of it is just the very strong level of demand in the United States. As I said, demand has recovered more than domestic production has. The way that demand has been satisfied, in part, is through imports, which are right now satisfying a growing amount of demand, especially in goods, and in part, it's inventories, which have continued to run down. Even in the third quarter, they ran down. They just didn't go down as much as they had in previous quarters. So the growth rate was positive. Final outlet for the demand in excess of the ability to produce, to satisfy that demand has been prices and inflation. This shows the PCE price index. I think it's widely understood that we're long past any base effects or temporary pandemic adjustment. Those prices are 1.8% above the 2% annual growth that the Fed was targeting prior to the pandemic. Moreover, the slope is higher than that 2% line, so you're getting further and further away. I want to spend a bunch of time now digging in more deeply on what's been going on with inflation and what the outlook for inflation is. The important aspect of inflation this year is just how terrible the forecasts have been. This is core PCE inflation. Back in February, the survey of professional forecasters expected 1.8% inflation. They put a 0.1% chance on inflation above 4%. In May, it was 2.3% with a 0.5% chance of inflation above 4%. In August, 3.7 with a 21% chance of 4%. My best guess right now is that for this year, this is going to be 4% plus. So most likely, what just 2 months ago was given 21% odds is now the most likely thing to happen. And so these aren't just large errors, they're incredibly overconfident. The Federal Reserve has made the same type of mistakes. If you look at 2021, it keeps revising up its inflation for the year. For 2022, it hasn't changed its inflation forecast very much. And in fact, at every point in time, right now, the Fed's last median, and I say the Fed, I'm talking the median FOMC member, the median FOMC member from September 2021, they had 3.7 for the year, but in order to hit that forecast, you needed inflation to fall to monthly prints like 0.1. You needed a dramatic decline in inflation to below a 2% annual rate to hit their last forecast. So you have a Fed that it's hard to tell right now whether the Fed is dovish forecast, which they definitely have, or do they have a dovish reaction function, which is to say, if inflation next year comes in at 3%, are they still going to want to keep rates low, not lift off, because they're a dovish reaction function? Or is their rate path because they believe their forecast, and if their forecast is wrong, they'll adjust their rate path? I think we don't know the answer to that question. And if inflation is on their forecast, we'll never find out. I think it's likely that inflation is going to be above their forecast. And so I think we will find out. So let's now look. Inflation almost certainly is going to slow. Inflation was growing at a 6% annual rate from February through July. But there's a big difference between whether it's going to slow to 4%, 3%, or 2%. And the Fed and most professional forecasters are in the 2% range. They're in the 2% range in part because they think that, correctly think that base effects and post-pandemic adjustments are mostly over. In part because they think that supply chains will eventually be resolved. And in part because they think peak fiscal support is past. I think all three of these is true. But nevertheless, I don't expect inflation to slow all the way back to the 2% we had before the crisis. And by the way, just to illustrate that, here's new and used vehicles. They were adding a lot to inflation back in April, May, and June. You're not going to continue to see orange bars that large on a sustained basis going forward. Although actually, I think the orange bars will be positive again for October when we get the data later this month. The blue bars, the pandemic affected services, they're not going to be as large as they were in April, May, and June. Although there too, you're going to see some bounce back in the pandemic affected services. But what I'd call your attention to is this other. This is everything else. And the other has been relatively constant this whole year. And in fact, there's some upward pressure in that other category. And that is running at a rate consistent with about 3% annual inflation. So, why do I think inflation is not going to slow as much as the Fed thinks? There's some shoes that are yet to drop. Shelter, health, service prices. All of those have a lot more room to move. Some of it in the very short run, as the Delta depressed prices and things like travel and airlines and hotels bounce back. But some of it, like shelter, where we expect to see very substantial lagged changes. Second, supply chain problems could last more than a year. Their different supply chains have different causes and different timetables for resolution. But more importantly, demand may remain very elevated. The economy has about 3 to 4% of GDP in fiscal support for fiscal year 2022. That's a lot less than last year, but that's a lot more than normal. Monetary policy and financial conditions continue to be exceedingly accommodative, and even with tapering, very, very accommodative. And households have substantial excess financial balances. Finally, and I think this is the biggest question mark, rapid nominal wage growth, which we're seeing, may pass into prices, and prices may pass into wages. This is not something we've seen a lot of over the last 30 years, but there's a lot of reasons in theory to expect it to happen. There's a lot of micro evidence that it happens, and I would rather rely on those than the behavior of a very different economy over the last 30 years to infer what's going to happen. But for me, that's the biggest question mark and the biggest upside risk to the inflation forecast. Just, the excess demand side, these are household cash balances, weekly checking account from JP Morgan Chase, and you see it's elevated for every household. This is just through July, but some more recent evidence suggests that's still true. And, the big question is, if I'm right, if the Fed is right and inflation is 2%, then they're correct to just focus on the employment shortfall. But what if the Fed is wrong? What if inflation is well above 2% and employment is still short of where they want it to be? What will they do then? They haven't told us what they'll do then. I'm not sure what they'll do then. My guess, though, is that they're likely to raise rates faster than they think. And I would put in, and I've actually had this forecast for 6 months now, two rate hikes in 2022. I think 3 is a real possibility, but to some degree, some of this is really, really untested. The final part, as I want to have a pretty full and long, so I don't think I've had to finish, discussion of fiscal policy and how it is impacting the outlook. The first thing to know is that 2022 is much less fiscal support than 2021, but 2022 in an absolute sense is still a lot of fiscal support. That's part of why I continue to expect upward pressure on inflation. But from 2023 to 2031, it's roughly net neutral. It depends not just on what Congress does in the next couple of weeks. They passed the infrastructure bill on Friday night. I expect them to pass the reconciliation bill in something like the form that President Biden put out over a week ago that was formalized in legislative language for the House of Representatives. I expect that to be at least an 85% chance of happening. Whether it does or doesn't happen, these diamonds are quite small. But fiscal policy is, I don't think, going to affect the outlook for inflation over the medium or long term. The question then is really not fiscal policy and inflation, but fiscal sustainability. The interest rates have continued to fall. CBO, this is the most important fact about the economy over the last couple decades. CBO, Congressional Budget Office, expects them to rise. The market doesn't expect them to rise as much, but under anyone's forecast, interest rates would still be lower than they have been for most of recent history. Low interest rates require us to rethink fiscal sustainability. Larry Summers and I have argued this in a paper a little bit over a year ago. The CBO baseline, the debt stabilizes at about 100% of GDP over the next decade. Under the Biden proposals, it's more like 115% of GDP. Is this too high? Is this not too high? Economists have a less good answer to this question than I would like them to have. We know the debt needs to be stable, but we have no idea if it needs to be stable at 200% of GDP, 100% of GDP, 50% of GDP. That's why I think it's useful to have a rule of thumb to let you assess where you are. And the rule of thumb that Larry Summers and I proposed is that real interest payments should be below 2% of GDP. Under the Biden proposals, that is satisfied over the next decade, but they are on a trajectory to rise above 2% of GDP. So in my view, at least, this is okay for the next decade. It's not okay forever. And that's contingent to some degree on do interest rates continue to stay as low as they have. This forecast builds in an increase in interest rates to above 3.5%, but they could go, of course, even higher than that, which would be a risk. So summarizing my macro evaluation of the congressional fiscal plans, aggregate demand and inflation, that's minimal because it's mostly offset. It's spread out over time. The Fed can offset it. Fiscal sustainability, you'll probably get to about 125% of GDP. I think with some additional eventual adjustments, that is sustainable. If the 10-year Treasury rate rises much above 4%, you'd need to rethink that. But given its value, it seems reasonable. And finally, from a microeconomic perspective, that's what I think is the most important lens to use for the congressional fiscal plan. What does the expanded productivity and labor force mean? How do you compare that to the changes from the tax increase? Overall, as I've tried to put together my own estimates, I see a small increase in output as a result of these plans, but I see a large positive impact on climate change, inclusion, opportunity, and other goals. So broadly speaking, I think of it as to some degree growth policy, but even more a policy that is intended to serve other goals. So I will stop sharing my slides and just say we continue to be at an uncertain time in the economy. If there's anything we can learn from forecasts over the last year and a half, it's that being overly confident in your forecast at a time like this is a big mistake. We are in a novel place in my experience, which is that the constraints on the economy are much more coming from the supply side than from the demand side. Yet we're continuing to, in the United States, use lots of demand policy. In Europe, use some demand policy. In China, it goes the other way, and the demand policy is more contractionary than it is expansionary. When we get out of this, we're going to need to get to a place in terms of growth where the fundamental drivers are in a better place. So in China, that means better quality of growth, shifting away from real estate. In the United States, it means more infrastructure, more innovation, and some more supportive labor markets with things like childcare and the like. And we'll see whether these two economies can make those types of adjustments and how long it takes to get them out of the rocky place that they're in right now. Thank you.
Okay, that's excellent. Everything is very clear, and yeah, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the very last few slides. The 2% real interest rate to GDP ratio, and also how much room we have for the U.S. fiscal policy. I think these numbers are actually considered by the Biden administration and the Democratic Party in their formal budget proposals. So these are kind of very unconventional ways to think about these issues, and that's a very actively debated area now. So now we can open up the floor for questions. Anyone from the audience who wants to ask questions can use the Q&A button to submit questions. We'll pass that on to Jason. I will just start with a kind of follow-up question on the fiscal front. So given the recent elections at the regional level, it looks like the Democratic Party is losing some support, and the president's approval rate is declining. So Jason, what do you think the Democratic Party, or if the White House stays with the Democrats, but they lose some congressional seats, if they lose the majority in both houses, what do you think the fiscal policy focus should be, and what they are kind of leaning towards in terms of future of the policy toolkits?
Yeah, so I don't update my forecast for the next election very much based on what happened last week. A lot of events can happen in a year. But even before last week, my forecast for next year would have been 85% chance that Democrats lose the House, 55% chance that they lose the Senate. And so the most likely scenario is divided government. In divided government in the past, sometimes there's been some run at deficit reduction. I don't see that happening now. The Republicans are less interested in deficit reduction than they've been for a long time. The Democrats are very disinterested in it too. So on fiscal policy, the question is, where can you find things where the Democrats get to spend something that they like and Republicans get to spend something they like? And there's a number of opportunities for this. The child tax credit will expanded amount will expire. If it's assuming it gets extended for 2022, it will expire after that year. So Democrats will really want to continue that. What will Republicans want? I don't know exactly, but maybe more defense spending. There's some corporate tax increases that are scheduled to happen. Maybe they'll want to turn those corporate tax increases off. And so to a first approximation, you'll see nothing happening on fiscal policy. To a second approximation, you'll see Republicans get their thing in exchange for Democrats getting their thing.
Fair. Yeah, it looks like the timing is also important because as we are moving towards the next election, it's kind of hard to give concessions on either side, right, to kind of make the other parties look good. Yeah, I hear you. It's difficult kind of to find middle ground, and probably we have fewer big policy movements on the fiscal side. So also, I think I want to let me go through the questions. We already have some people asking questions. Okay, all right. I think here is a good one. In terms of labor market supplies, I think you've emphasized the importance on the supply side. How much labor can come back? So what do you think is the reason for people not coming into work? Is that the common reasons people say, like excess unemployment benefits, lack of childcare, or the scare of viruses? How much weight do you give each of those factors?
Yeah, so the labor force participation rate is down 1.7 percentage points since prior to the crisis. 1/4 of that is simply the aging of the population, and something we would have expected to happen even if there wasn't a crisis. 1/4 of that is continued economic weakness, which you're seeing especially in a number of service sectors, but half of it is other factors. So what is that other half? I think unemployment insurance played a role, and that's mostly past, but there continues to be an income effect of higher cash balances enable households to be in a less of a rush to go into jobs. I think there's not a lot of evidence that childcare was a very large factor. I thought it was. I went to research it and quantify it, and to my surprise, found out that it really just the data wasn't there to show. Now it's a real issue. It's a real challenge. It just doesn't add up to a lot. You look at the number of people who are dealing with depression, anxiety, mood disorders caused by COVID and its fallout. Could that be 1 or 2 million people? Yes, that's a decent chunk of what we're talking about. So broadly speaking, I think that it is likely that this is not a permanent shift. I don't believe in the Great Resignation. I don't believe there's been a big cultural change. So I think we will get back to something more normal. I don't know how long that will take.
Fair. That's interesting because our team also dug into the childcare impact on labor supply, and we didn't find anything. It's interesting, like children, families with child, the male participation rates dropped even more than female, which it's hard to kind of put that number into the common popular narratives. And also, I think one last question I would like to ask is how about this one? This is also from the audience. Can you also talk a little bit about kind of U.S. policy towards China? I think we want to focus on the economic policy. Maybe just we focus on the trade policy. What's the kind of the goals of U.S. trade policy now is, and what they're trying to achieve, and what's your outlook?
Yeah. So first of all, just my own substantive perspective is the United States has done a good job identifying every supply chain, supply side policy lever it has to deal with the inflation, to deal with the shortages, with the very big exception of tariffs on China. So I think that is a big tool that the administration could do if it wanted to help unclog some of the supply chain issues. Of course, that would come at some political cost in the United States. My perception is that in some ways, maybe the United States is more anxious to do that because it understands that these tariffs are hurting some of the issues it cares about than China is, which has gotten more used to living under tariffs with the United States, and would rather not have them, but isn't particularly desperate to get rid of them anytime soon. The status quo, not getting worse, not getting better, remains the most plausible scenario here. But I could see that I could see real motivation to do something to reduce the tariffs to deal with the supply chain issues.
Okay, cool. I think it's time is up. There are more questions, and I have more questions. But unfortunately, that's end of this session. I want to thank you, Professor Jason Furman, for this excellent talk. And by the way, if anyone who wants to follow Jason on Twitter, you can follow him. His handle is @JasonFurman. He's tweeting real substances on real time, and that's a rare thing on Twitter, but he does that. So yeah, let's conclude this session, and thank you for the audiences who's engaged and asking questions. And let's move on to the rest of today's program. And the rest of today's programs includes investment channels, panels on China specifically and ESG specifically. And also the last one is a broad cross-section across assets global investment panel. So stay tuned and stay with us. And thank you, Professor. You may disconnect. And thank you, everyone. Bye.